and gentlemen, good evening. Can I start by introducing myself? My name is Mark Smith and I'm the Vice-Chancellor at Lancaster University. It's a great pleasure to be here and to see so many people coming out to hear tonight's lecture. I'm acting as compere, so I will get on to the main event quickly. It's a great pleasure to introduce tonight's lecture entitled Letters, Lamps and Laughing Gas, Unearthing the Private Writings of Sir Humphry Davy. It's being given by one of my colleagues. In fact, one of the great pleasures of my job is to find out all of the fantastic and varied things that happen at the university. Coming along tonight, I had a little taster of this probably about 6 months ago when I did my departmental visits, and Sharon gave a few tantalising insights into some of the work that she'd been doing, so I was determined to come along tonight to find out a little bit more. So, as you're probably aware, Davy was one of the greatest chemists of all time, certainly one of British chemists, greatest British chemists of all time, uncovering a huge number of chemical elements, more than anyone else has ever done before or since. And he was the first inhaler of nitrous oxide, or laughing gas. In those days, there wasn't any health and safety, so you could get away with almost anything. He certainly would have been, he'd probably been fired these days for doing something like that, but there you go. That's how the world has changed. He was also an inventor. He invented, of course, the Davy lamp for miners to prevent them blowing themselves up. So it was actually, he did have one eye actually on health and safety. Although some of the results were mixed, as we'll find out. And one other thing, which is, for those of you that don't know my background, I can't claim this anymore, I was a professor of physics. And one of my heroes was Michael Faraday. And I used to teach for many years. I used to teach electromagnetism. In fact, I claim, and some other people, actually some historians claim, that actually Davy's greatest discovery was actually Michael Faraday. What we're here tonight to learn about is, in fact, Davy was a Renaissance man in many ways. He was skilled in both the arts and the sciences, and wrote poetry from a young age, as his notebooks will testify, because he wrote them at the same time he was doing experiments. So he was also a prolific letter writer. And Professor Sharon Ruston, got it right?
Yeah.
Good. Has been funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, we mustn't forget the plug for our sponsors, to explore Davy's letters, many of which are as yet unpublished. So we're going to go into a realm tonight for the first time. So it's a great privilege to be able to do that. And Sharon's research will culminate in the publication of a book with these collection of letters. So we're going to get an insight tonight before that book's published. You can get your order in now for 2018. But anyway, Sharon will explore what these letters actually reveal about Davy as both a public figure and a poet, and the controversy that followed his invention of the Davy lamp. But that's enough from me. I turn without any more ado to welcome Professor Sharon Ruston.
Thank you all for coming today. So I want to start by asking how many people remember writing letters? I've just been hearing about people who write letters. Have you kept letters from people who meant a lot to you in your life? Do you have love letters? Have any of you held on to letters that might be useful for a bit of blackmailing later on? Of course not. None of the people here would do that. So even though emails are not as ephemeral or as easy to get rid of as we think, they may well never actually permanently be deleted, which is a scary thing to think about. We tend not to print out emails or to keep them in the way that we used to keep letters. Letters can be intensely and intimately private. They can be intended for only one reader, and as with all handwritten manuscripts, the crossings out, the insertions and the corrections often reveal more than the author ever intended to reveal. So since 2008, I've been searching out and transcribing the letters of one of the most famous men of the 19th century, Sir Humphry Davy. These letters are held in archives around the world, and I'm currently annotating them with my co-editor, Professor Tim Fulford from De Montfort University, and as we've heard, this will result in a 4-volume print edition to be published by Oxford University Press in 2018. So our edition will feature 1,200 letters written by Davy himself, the transcriptions of which can be seen at the moment on our website. You can search the website and look for things like the word poetry or whatever takes your fancy. Only 250 of these 1,200 letters have ever been published before, and some of those, only a few words of them in Victorian texts. It's an odd thing to read someone's letters, especially when they could not, presumably, have imagined anyone doing so 200 years later. Not all of Davy's letters are private, but some of them are very much so. I can already see, hopefully, that the edition will be groundbreaking in a number of areas, not least in publishing for the very first time approximately 100 letters on the subject of Davy's most famous invention, the miner's safety lamp, which became known as the Davy lamp. So these are the letters that I'm going to concentrate on today, but first I'll tell you a little bit about the man himself. I'll briefly discuss the nitrous oxide experiments that made him famous, and I'll give you some idea of his life and career to the time of the invention of the Davy lamp. I'll also give some sense why Davy is such an important figure in the literary world and to the relationship between poetry and science at the time. Then I'll explain why a safety lamp was needed, explore how it worked and the issue over who first invented it. And I'll discuss the way that Davy's letters reveal more about this highly controversial episode in the history of science. So as has already been mentioned, Davy wrote poetry throughout his entire life. It was clearly something of which he was very proud. I've discovered that Davy did in fact publish some of his poems within his lifetime, though they were anonymous, so it's been quite hard to find those poems. But he also circulated them in manuscript form, and he liked to read them at parties to his friends. I'm not going to speak much about the poetry today, but I will end this talk with an unfinished poem that he wrote about the safety lamp controversy. So Davy was born in 1778 in Penzance. He came from relatively humble origins and was originally apprenticed to become an apothecary. All of this changed, however, when he showed as a precocious young lad that he had a real talent for chemistry. He was appointed to superintend the new Pneumatic Institute at Clifton in Bristol 2 months before his 20th birthday, and there he became the first person to inhale nitrous oxide. The Pneumatic Institute was run by a rather infamous man, who was a thorn in the government's side because he was in favour of the sentiments of the French Revolution. Thomas Beddoes, who was famously called a little fat Democrat, had married one of the novelist Maria Edgeworth's sisters. Theirs was a busy household, and friends who shared their political views gathered around the Pneumatic Institute at this time to try nitrous oxide, which was thought to be a wonder drug. This is a cartoon showing poets writing their poetry under the influence of nitrous oxide. So in this youthful period, Davy also seems to have been quite a radical in his politics, and this is worth keeping in mind when you hear some of his later high Tory sentiments as he gets older. So nitrous oxide, also known as laughing gas, now in the press again as hippie crack, was thought to be fatal when Davy first breathed it. Just have a think about that for a minute. So everyone thinks it's fatal if you breathe it, so he gives it a go. Is this bravery or foolhardiness? I don't know. But also consider for a moment just how important nitrous oxide has been as an anaesthetic since then. Robert Southey, who had become the poet laureate in 1813, declared to his brother Tom, "Davy has actually invented a new pleasure for which language has no name. Oh, Tom, I am going for more this evening. It makes one so strong and so happy, so gloriously happy, and without any after debility, but instead of it, increased strength and activity of mind and body. Oh, excellent airbag. Tom, I am sure the air in heaven must be this wonder-working gas of delight." The poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge described beating the ground with his feet when he tried it with Davy. Anna Barbauld, the poet, tried it, as did the author of The Thesaurus, Peter Mark Roget, and many others. And Davy himself became not a little addicted to nitrous oxide. And brilliantly, his notebooks, which we still have, record his experiments with nitrous oxide. So he tries to record what he's feeling at the time when he takes the drug. So, for example, he took a bag of nitrous oxide to Tintern Abbey with him to try and have a more sublime experience than Wordsworth had described in his poem. And there's also an extremely revealing entry in one notebook. If you can see down the bottom, there is Davy and Newton. The feeling produced by breathing 7 quarts of nitrous oxide mingled with some atmospheric air. So that's what it made him feel. This is the self-aggrandizing effects of the drug, or perhaps Davy's sense of himself as well. So Davy, as we've heard, is also credited with the isolation of a number of chemical elements, though some of these are disputed. And he did this work at the Royal Institution of Great Britain, which here it is, an imposing building which still stands in Albemarle Street in London. He used the new science of electrochemistry to isolate elements such as potassium, sodium, chlorine, magnesium, barium and boron. At the Royal Institution, he became known as a charismatic and popular lecturer, and many middle-class women attended his lectures in chemistry. So even though Davy made a point of never keeping the correspondence that he received, we usually only have his one-way correspondence, so the letters that Davy writes, even though he never did that, he did actually keep the fan mail that he was sent by the women that came to his lectures. Extracts of Davy's lectures, which Coleridge attended to, quote, increase his stock of metaphors for his poems, found their way into the lectures of Professor Waldman in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, almost word for word. So it's quite clear that Mary Shelley based Victor Frankenstein's teacher on Humphry Davy. You can kind of map Davy's lectures onto those lectures. Davy's lectures were so popular that Albemarle Street became the first one-way street in London, because the carriages who were trying to get to the lectures couldn't go both ways, so they made it a one-way street. So Davy was so much a friend of what we would now call the Romantic poets that Coleridge wrote to him on the 16th of July 1800 with the request, will you be so kind as just to look over the sheets of the Lyrical Ballads? The Lyrical Ballads, for those of you who don't know, was a collection of poems first published in 1798, mainly written by Wordsworth, but also with some quite famous poems by Coleridge, such as The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which I think people will know. Now, the second edition of 1800 contained the new preface, written by Wordsworth, which has been read as a kind of manifesto for Romantic poetry. In a footnote to the preface, Wordsworth famously argued that rather than opposing poetry and prose, the more philosophical distinction is between poetry and science. This moment has been held as no less than the start of the schism between the arts and sciences, or the beginning of the division into the two cultures, as C.P. Snow put it in 1959. Wordsworth wrote to Davy himself on the 29th of July 1800, asking him personally to proofread the second volume of the Lyrical Ballads. He asked him specifically to correct in the poems anything you find amiss in the punctuation, a business at which I'm ashamed to say that I am no adept. I think this is quite shocking. I don't know if anyone else is shocked. So academics have spent their lives studying the punctuation of Wordsworth's poems, which may have been Davy's punctuation. I think students might be surprised to know that Wordsworth wasn't very good at punctuation as well. So there's persuasive evidence that when Wordsworth revised his preface for the third edition of the Lyrical Ballads, which was published in 1802, and he inserted a new lengthy section on the differences between the poet and the man of science, that this was directly influenced by Davy. Wordsworth owned a copy of Davy's syllabus of a course of lectures on chemistry delivered at the Royal Institution of London, and in that, Davy had argued that a chemist, as much as a poet, could be creative and imaginative. Davy applied much the same terms that Wordsworth had in his preface, but instead of applying them to poetry, Davy applied them to chemistry. Poetry and science have far more in common in Wordsworth's 1802 preface than they did in the 1800 one. Davy and Wordsworth met in person for the first time in the summer of 1805 when they and the novelist Walter Scott climbed Helvellyn together. In Wordsworth's memorable account of this, there's quite an amazing group of people there. So Wordsworth, Davy and Walter Scott, they climbed Helvellyn together, but Wordsworth says that Davy got bored because they were older than him and he climbed down quicker than them and just left them up there. In 1812, Davy married a wealthy widow who was also a literary socialite and gave up his paid position at the Royal Institution. 3 days before his wedding, he was knighted, and by this point, he's come a long way from his apprenticeship as an apothecary. He embarked on a grand tour of Europe, treating Michael Faraday terribly, using him as a kind of valet on the trip. And by this stage in his life, we can already see that his politics are quite different from what they were in Bristol. So this brief account has hopefully given you the context for the Davy that I'm going to focus on now for the remainder of my talk. So the Davy of 1815, so just over 200 years ago from today. So the safety lamp. Miners needed to be able to take candles down the mine so that they could see what they were doing, but this was extremely dangerous. Fire damp, largely made up of highly flammable methane gas, could ignite in the candle's flame, and the resulting explosion was often devastating. An explosion at Felling Colliery, near Gateshead, on the 25th of May 1812, killed 92 men and boys. And this motivated coal mine owners to see what could be done. The society set up to investigate such disasters decided to write to Humphry Davy, the most famous chemist of the time. He replied on the 3rd of August, and his early letters are perhaps characteristically optimistic and very confident and assured. He realises very early on that he'll be able to help, and he sets his mind to developing a lamp that will produce sufficient light for the miners to do their work, but which will not inflame the gas. Davy couches his potential contribution from the outset as a scientific one that could be of practical application. So in this first letter to the coal mine owners, he says, "It will give me very great satisfaction if my chemical knowledge can be of any use in an inquiry so interesting to humanity." But there were others at the same time setting their minds to this task. So Davy went to Newcastle and visited some mines in late August 1815, and at this time he was lent overnight a bellows lamp that had been invented by a Dr. William Reed Clanny. Remember his name, he's going to be important. But this lamp was thought to be not very effective in a mine. So there's Clanny and there's his lamp. It actually took 2 people to be able to work the lamp, so this is why it's not hugely effective. So Davy was lent this lamp in Newcastle, and then he goes back to London and he continues his experiments at the Royal Institution in a laboratory. And after creating a succession of lamps, in December 1815, he hit upon the aspect for which he is now famous. And this is his own unique contribution to the safety lamp. And this is the use of wire gauze in the lamp, which allows the light to shine out but does not allow the flame to pass through, thus meaning that explosion will not occur. So this is the very first Davy lamp. It's still in the Royal Institution. Even before this, as early as the 5th of December 1815, Davy had already been accused of stealing Clanny's bellows lamp. And he'd been accused of this in a letter from one of Clanny's supporters in the Tyne Mercury. And thus began a protracted and often very nasty campaign on all sides through the medium of letters that were sent to editors of a number of regional and national newspapers. So during this same period, George Stephenson, yes, it is that George Stephenson, who obviously became far more famous for other things, but he had developed a lamp to be used in the mines at the same time. Stephenson had developed his lamp through working in the mine himself. He was first an engine man in a pit before working his way up to become an engine wright at Killingworth Colliery. He was illiterate till the age of 18, George Stephenson. His safety lamp, which did go into wide use, particularly in the North East, particularly Sunderland and places like that, was called the Geordie. Stephenson had tested his first lamp in Killingworth on the 21st of October 1815, so long, months before the wire gauze, and it went through several versions. So here you can see the differences between the two lamps. So if you're looking at this, on your left you've got Davy's safety lamp, and then the other 2 are both Stephenson's lamp. So as you can see on the far right, that it actually had a glass container and then a tin cover would go over the top. So Professor Frank James at the Royal Institution has written an excellent article on the safety lamp and the ensuing controversy over who actually invented it, which is called "How Big is a Hole?" It's been hugely helpful in my annotating and editing of these letters. As Frank's essay title suggests, the matter of who first invented the safety lamp turned on the question of how important were the size of the holes in the lamp. Davy was the first to use wire gauze, but Stephenson thought gauze was mere ornament. The fact that there were holes at all was the point. And you can see that there were holes both in the bottom and the top of the glass lamp, and then all the way down the cover. One of the things that publishing these letters will reveal is just how much Davy's lamp continued to evolve and change even after the discovery of the wire gauze. He continually is changing his instructions on how big the holes should be, how thick the wire should be. So if you remember, the holes in the gauze allowed the candle to emit light, while the thickness of the wire used in the gauze absorbed the heat of the flame so that there wouldn't be an explosion. And every time, Davy represents his as a scientific discovery, made in the laboratory and dependent upon his superior knowledge of chemistry, compared to Stevenson. As this hopefully suggests, the controversy became, in the end, really a war of words. Davy maintained that Stevenson must have stolen his idea because he could never have understood the science behind it. Davy portrayed his contribution as scientific research culminating in philosophical transaction papers that improved our knowledge of flame. And Davy was awarded a gift of plate in 1817, inscribed with this message: presented to Sir Humphry Davy by the subscribers as a token of gratitude for his invaluable invention of the safety lamp. So note there that it's the safety lamp, his invention of the safety lamp. I'll come back to this. For posterity, the safety lamp was declared to be Davy's invention and taught to those of us of a certain age in Britain, particularly in the South, I think, as the highest example of a man of science, beneficent gift to humanity. Davy never patented the lamp, and I remember being taught how wonderful this was. I very much doubt whether Davy could have got a patent for this lamp, because Stevenson had invented it first. He would not have really been on stable ground, I don't think. But in any case, by this time, Davy shunned all sense of monetary gain from his scientific endeavours, as befitted his elevated social position. He was made a baronet in 1818 for the invention of the lamp, and he was the first man of science to have that title. So I now want to discuss a particular set of letters that will be published for the first time in its entirety in our edition. These are letters to the Reverend John Hodgson of Bishop Wearmouth in the North East, and they're held in the Woodhorn Museum in Ashington. And they're one of the best examples that we have of an entire run of correspondence. So Hodgson kept all of the letters that Davy sent to him. Hodgson was important because he'd published an account of the Felling Colliery disaster, which was in his parish, and it was a very graphic account, and it was partly this that inspired or motivated the coal mine owners to ask Davy to come up with a lamp. There are 53 letters from Davy to Hodgson, written between 1815 and 1818, and then Hodgson had them bound into a book, so they're now in a letter book. Our edition will be the first to present transcriptions of them, all fully annotated. And these letters in Hodgson's letter book actually seem to me to have been organised and arranged with a specific purpose in mind, to support Davy's priority claim for the lamp. The letter book also presents other kinds of evidence. I don't know when Hodgson made the letters into the letter book. He lives longer than Davy does, to 1845. Davy died in 1829. But when Hodgson does make this into a letter book, he also includes all sorts of other materials that are relevant to the issues of the lamp. So these letters provide, they potentially reveal the identities of those who wrote anonymous and pseudonymous letters to the newspapers. And since the newspapers never published some of these, the evidence contained within the letter book is all that we have to prove the existence of some of these attacks. But we do know that Davy knew about these attacks because we know that Hodgson sent them to him, because we have Davy's replies to Hodgson. These letters from Davy to Hodgson constitute some of the most private in the edition. They reveal Davy's anger and annoyance at Stevenson's and Clanny's rival claims to priority in the question of who invented the lamp first. So when Hodgson had these letters bound, he numbered the pages, he inserted other materials that were relevant to the events unfolding, and some of these materials constitute the only known examples of privately printed pamphlets, newspaper articles, proof copies of published texts with handwritten corrections, and letters from other people that help us to explain Davy's letters. So it's an amazing thing, this letter book. Hodgson even helpfully dates for me some of Davy's undated letters. So later on he's kind of written in pencil what he thinks the date is, and he writes notes on the letters that recall the events of the letters, such as this: March 15, 1816. I breakfasted with Sir H. Davy, Mr. Pepys and Mr. Solly on their way to Melrose. That was actually Melrose in Scotland, which he's spelt wrong with. That took me ages to work out what that was. But this is generally very, very helpful, because he's annotating these letters, but I don't know when, I don't know how much time has passed, is his memory very good, and that sort of thing. So he not only numbers the pages, he indexes the entire letter book. Who was this for? I'm absolutely fascinated by this. Did he know I would come along and need all this material? So in a highly contentious battle between Stevenson's and Davy's supporters, this letter book is an artefact that does not simply document the safety lamp controversy, it plays an active role within it, I would argue. So the letters have been organised and arranged to present a particular narrative, one that is intended to exonerate Davy and support his claim that he invented the lamp first. The chronology of events becomes a matter of burning importance. On the 5th of September 1816, John Buddle, who was a mine viewer who also supported Davy, wrote to John Hodgson telling him that Davy would arrive in Newcastle that day, and then he asks him, at Davy's request, I don't know, whether Hodgson could find Davy's letter in which he first informed you of his discovery of the principle of safety lamps. I think this is fascinating. He said, "Do you remember exactly when Davy said to you?" And he asked if he could bring the letter with him. So as I've mentioned, it's often the crossings out and the insertions above the line, the angry cross-written text and the postscripts that reveal far more than the author ever intended. Buddle's self-correction here makes it clear that it's not just Davy's discovery of the principle behind his safety lamps that is at stake, because that would imply that Davy's safety lamp was not the safety lamp. Instead, he makes it clear that it is the principle behind safety lamps generally that he's talking about. So the personal pronoun formed a sticking point in the subsequent debate. In another example, Stevenson was to be remunerated for his safety lamp, not for the safety lamp, according to the Newcastle Weekly Chronicle. In a pseudonymous letter to the Newcastle Courant, Aladdin, can you see what he's doing with that name? Aladdin noted that the committee appointed to prepare the offering to Sir H. Davy would not allow themselves to be fettered by the resolutions of the first meeting, which declared the plate to be given to Sir H. Davy for the invention of his safety lamp, and which was ingeniously altered by the second meeting into his invention of the safety lamp. Now, Davy persists in misspelling Stevenson's name throughout his letters. I'm absolutely sure that that is deliberate and that he knew how to spell Stevenson's name. It's also probably deliberate, it's certainly telling, that Davy never calls him Mr. Stevenson in any of the letters. According to Davy, then, Stevenson is not a gentleman and therefore should not be given this title. Instead, as things progress, Davy describes Stevenson and his supporters using a number of unflattering terms, which you could never have imagined I'd be telling you all now here, I imagine, such as here to Hodgson on the 27th of October 1816. I can only pity those persons whose malevolence induces them to find in the incoherent dreams of an ignorant mechanic, not told at all or told only to persons as ignorant as himself, the germs of an important discovery. It's quite interesting that the two was missed out there. I've added it in the square brackets, and that's very uncharacteristic of Davy. So that missing word already tells me that he's under some mental pressure or stress when he writes this. So I think there's an echo here of Shakespeare's Macbeth. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. But Stevenson is an ignorant mechanic, reminding us here also potentially of Bottom in Midsummer Night's Dream, whose incoherent dreams are not to be taken as containing the germs of an important discovery. We see here the claim that Stevenson's invention is not informed by scientific knowledge. In fact, Davy's letters to Hodgson, and Hodgson's letter book more generally, present the tale of the lamp, or a tale of his lamp, pointing out what happened when and what evidence there is of this. And Davy's letters become increasingly angry. There are words missing, they are often cross-written, which is when you write all the way down, then you turn the page and then write over the writing. Written down the side. He's often annoyed at himself for engaging in this debate at all, and we see sarcasm, pettiness, and class superiority very much on show. Clanny's and Stevenson's supporters took to writing letters to their regional newspapers, and in their defences took such pseudonyms as Fair Play or Aladdin. Hodgson's letter books contain private letters that give more information about these published letters. For example, a letter from Buddle to Hodgson on the 10th of November 1816 informs him that Aladdin was in fact the pseudonym of Robert William Brandling, one of Stevenson's main supporters and the family that owned the Felling Colliery. So we get in one of the letters, the letter Aladdin is Brandling's own. It is evidently his sneering style. In Hodgson's letter book, there is a draft of one letter that Hodgson sent to Davy on the 20th of May 1816. This is very unusual. You don't tend to get drafts. I mean, some people, I imagine, wrote drafts usually, but I haven't come across them very often. But it's incredibly useful for us because Davy never kept his incoming correspondence. So for this one letter, I have a draft of what must have been something like the letter that Davy received. I wonder whether it's because of the very delicate topic that Hodgson was writing about that he wrote a draft of this letter particularly. So in this draft letter, Hodgson claimed that a very venomous paper on the subject of wire gauze cylinders, now if you remember that's Davy's own unique contribution to the safety lamp, had been signed a friend and had been published in the Tyne Mercury, had in fact been written by Dr. William Reed Clanny. Remember him? Of the bellows lamp. Hodgson then claims that Clanny next had sent a poetical performance in the Hudibrastic style, or doggerel 3-double, pseudonymously to the local newspapers, which he had signed Tam Glen, and which they considered so mischievous and malignant that they wouldn't publish. Hudibras was a mock heroic poem by Samuel Butler, written between 1663 and 1678. It's a particularly appropriate style for an attack on Davy. It's written in iambic tetrameter with closed couplets. It features a number of feminine rhymes. It concerns a knight. Remember, Davy was knighted in 1812, a few days before his marriage to the wealthy widow Jane Priest. And the poem lavishes what is clearly meant to be excessive praise upon the subject. So the message being sent would be that, like Hudibras, Davy does not deserve the praise that he receives. On the 20th of April, the editor of the Newcastle Weekly Chronicle noted that the lines signed Tam Glen and the letter from Alston. I don't know what the letter from Alston is, and I'm not bothered about that either. I'm interested in these lines from Tam Glen have been received, but we must beg to decline the insertion of either. A few weeks ago, Ian Winship, a volunteer at the North East Institute of Mining, found that in fact this poem by Tam Glen had been published elsewhere as Hocus Pocus or The Juggle of the Lamp. I'm not going to read the whole thing out, but it is really quite funny. He found it in a short-lived journal called The Monthly Visitor or Universal Entertainer, which was published in Newcastle only over 2 years, 1816, 1817. The poem is in rattling iambic tetrameter and it is quite funny, claiming that Davy had stolen Clanny's idea. Interestingly, a footnote states that the poem was written by a London artist and not by the gentleman to whom it has generally been attributed, who's Clanny, I imagine. I wonder whether we'll ever know who really did write this poem, but I'm very glad to have found the poem, which was never published in the newspaper that I looked at. After further attacks in the press, Davy wrote and sent to John Buddle in a letter what he called two specimens of proper advertisements for Brandling and Stevenson. So this is Davy getting his own back, and he writes in the same style as these kind of things that we've been looking at, and he writes them in a letter. And these I find utterly intriguing. They're Davy's own attempts at the kind of things that were being published by Clanny's and Stevenson's supporters in the regional newspapers. They don't seem to have been published, at least I haven't found them yet, most probably because they're just far too nasty to be published. So if I just give you the one that Davy writes about Brandling here. If you remember, Brandling was supposed to be Aladdin. A specimen of an advertisement suited to Mr. W. Brandling. Aladdin should sign his name Assassin, for he endeavours to stab in the dark. An assassin is a proper associate for a private purloiner. One may attempt to murder while the other carries off the plunder. Mr. W. J. Brandlin must be ashamed of such friends as Aladdin and Fair Play. At least he cannot wish to be seen in public with them, even though he should love them as dearly as himself. Signed Truth. That was the pseudonym that Davy took for this. So in this advertisement, Aladdin, associated with the lamp and with light, becomes assassin who works in the dark. To stab in the dark is to make a guess, but also not to fight fairly, to attack under cover of dark, thus drawing attention to the fact that Aladdin does not give his real name. If Brandling is Aladdin, and I like the sound of the two names. I think that Brandling and Aladdin sounds similar, so I do wonder whether that was the pseudonym that Brandling took. But if Brandling is Aladdin, then his proper associate is Stevenson, the private purloiner, one who steals another's ideas, according to Davy. The next sentence begins, one may, and it may echo Hamlet, one may smile and be a villain. But Hamlet refers only to one person, where Davy refers here to two. One may attempt to murder while the other carries off the plunder. Davy's deliberate misdirection, where he names Brandling as the friend of Aladdin and Fair Play, is already fretted with Davy's own sneering style. The final line implies that Brandling does not appear in public with them because he is actually one of them, if not both of them. The final dig is that he does not appear in public because he hides behind one or other of these pseudonyms. So these examples of the public style in a private letter demonstrate Davy's anger at what he sees as the underhand tactics employed by Stevenson's supporters. He deigns to stoop to their level here, but shows himself adept at employing the genre for his own purposes. I'm utterly intrigued about why he wrote this and then sent it to Buddle. Is it like one of those emails you write in anger and then you delete? Did he intend for it to be published? Did he want Buddle to go away and to publish it? I don't know. It certainly reveals Davy's bitterness at the treatment that he feels he's received in the press, for example. So as I hope I've shown you with these examples, some of the detail of this controversy would not see the light of day without our edition. Davy's specimens, for example, seem never to have been published, and they only exist in these letters. Similarly, there is an unfinished poem that Davy wrote in one of his later notebooks about the safety lamp that may well show his true final state of his feelings. So I'm going to end with this. This is the manuscript. This is the kind of handwriting that I have to deal with on a daily basis. So it is unfinished, and there's lots of bits that don't quite make sense. Here's my transcription of it. So it's called Thoughts After the Ingratitude of the Northumbrians with Respect to the Safety Lamp. And though in all my intercourse with man the feelings recollected scarcely leave aught to admire or glory in, though good has been replaced with evil, and a light of science and humanity received with stern ingratitude, yet have I not resorted or relaxed in labours high for these my enemies. And if a glow of indignation has oppressed my mind, it was but transitory, like the chill of a snow cloud in summer, which though dark and threatening soon in genial dews, dissolves to vivify the parched earth. And I have not both coldness and unkindness, as the fair plant of Ceylon, coquilion tree, which, when cut, does not alone perfume the axe, but gives a balmy oil which preserves its harsh and sullen texture from decay. So he's really quite unhappy at the start of this poem. When he remembers his dealings with men over the past years, they have rarely offered anything worth admiration or glory. Obviously, the light of science and humanity is the lamp itself, as well as the scientific knowledge behind it. Even despite all of this, even though good has been replaced by evil, he claims to have refused to resort to the levels that his enemies went to. In any case, he has not stopped working on his important labours since then. He writes that the indignation that he felt has only been a transitory emotion. He likens it to a snow cloud in summer that actually does more good than harm in watering the much-needed parched earth. Similarly, the oil from the unnamed plant from Sri Lanka, or perhaps the South American coquilla palm tree, does not only perfume the blade of the axe which wounds it, it also preserves the tree itself from decay. This poem perhaps gives Davy's final word on the matter, his view of the safety lamp episode on reflection. He is no doubt bitter, but he is also resilient. By being cut, and it's interesting that he changes wounded, he crosses out and then uses the word cut, which is a far less emotive word, I think. The tree can continue because the balmy oil is needed to preserve it. So to conclude, the question of who invented the lamp first turns on issues of chronology, scientific knowledge and language, all of which are established within Davy's letters. Letters are of crucial importance in establishing what went on when. Hodgson's letter book shows that this effort continued beyond the immediate event of the lamp's development. Davy's letters to Hodgson are retrospectively arranged in order and sequence, bound, paginated, annotated and indexed to support a particular version of the story of the safety lamp. Davy's private responses to published letters see him imitate, perhaps parody, the specimen of writing identified as an advertisement in the newspapers, and reveals his bitterness at what he perceived as ingratitude on the part of those he served. Thank you.